Welcome back to the Deep 404. I'm going to talk a little bit now just about Ukraine, what's happened there in the last couple of days. In terms of the conflict and the reported numbers of Ukrainian losses across the front line, the last 24 hours has been a day of heavy fighting and severe losses for Ukraine. I'll get to that in a moment. Avdiivka, obviously a large part of that, and it now looking like it's turning into two separate cauldrons for the Ukrainian forces. It seems the Russians have been successful in moving from the northeast above the quarry lake and making their way down to the train station, effectively cutting Avdiivka in half now, with the bottom half almost completely surrounded. The top half where the coke plant is, again there a lot of Russian forces able to now move underneath to the south around the eastern sides and north of the coke plant. The Russians now well within range of the remaining supply road for Ukraine to Avdiivka. Mikhail Volterson on Twitter, on X, has posted some good comments about this. If you look up Mikhail Volterson, find him. He's very informative. He believes that Ukraine has reached the position in Avdiivka where they will be attempting to evacuate on the main supply road, that they are likely to struggle. And if that main supply road is closed for more than a 48-hour period, they will then look to evacuate via a smaller access route that they have. In either case, such evacuation will be very costly to the Ukrainians unless for some reason the Russians decide to allow them to evacuate, giving them safe corridor. If that's not the decision, then they're in a position now where already they are well under Russian artillery fire. Under tank range. They are, even in some regions now, those roads will be under just direct assault rifle range. The Russians are getting to areas where they've cut through Avdiivka, where it's down to probably now tens of meters before they have the entire township of Avdiivka just sliced in half. So that's happening. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But of course, the big news is finally the announcement about General Zaluzhny. He has been relieved of his command and has been replaced by General Oleksandr Syrskyi. General Syrski has been commander of Ukrainian ground forces. He is reportedly far more loyal to President Zelensky and doesn't have the same conflicts of interest that General Zaluzhny has appeared to have had. There have been multiple reports where General Zaluzhny has indicated he would recommend the withdrawal from positions, Bakhmut being one of those. Perhaps Avdiivka, another. He has called time on Ukrainian offensives, seeing them as becoming pointless, and instead suggesting that they're at a stalemate and that Ukraine would be better served to move to defensive positions, pulling troops out of these active areas where they are trying to hold ground, instead focusing on building defences in the rear, such that if the Russians do continue to advance forward, they're better able to repel them there, instead of pouring men into situations like Avdiivka where they are losing many men there and they are ultimately going to lose that township. Avdiivka, of course, in the Western press now, is becoming non-strategic, not important, really, would just be a bit of a PR victory for Russia if they were to take it. This, of course, is not the case. Avdiivka, just to the west of Donetsk city, has been a position which has been fought over since 2014, since the internal civil war within Ukraine began as the Donetsk and Luhansk regions decided to fight for their independence. This is a major loss in the Ukrainian line, as this is a heavily fortified township. Um, there has been 10 years for the Ukrainians to fortify this already strongly defendable position, being the coke plant and all the industrial buildings there, concrete, steel, that sort of thing. So the loss of this town is a significant loss, and it will be a significant loss within the military, regardless of what the Western press might say. Within the Ukrainian military, once word comes out that Avdiivka has fallen to the Russians, morale will fall with that. The replacement of General Zaluzhny with General Syrskyi, also one which reportedly is not going to be well accepted by the military. General Syrski is Russian of origin, born in Russia. He has history of his military training with Russia and experience there. He has a checkered reputation. His history reportedly is not great in terms of his military successes. And rightly or wrongly, he is considered someone who has a higher priority for his allegiance to President Zelensky than perhaps the men who serve under him. And there is concern that in Avdiivka, he will now look to pour reserves in there and hold Avdiivka. There are reports coming from Ukrainian channels, the resident Ukrainian channel, that Syrsky has begun to transfer reserves to Avdiivka in order to break through the encirclement of the city and fulfill his promise to Zelensky. He reportedly, this is what the resident Ukrainian channel is saying, is that unlike Zaluzhny, General Syrskyi does not oppose the president's decisions. And if the president says we must hold Avdiivka, then General Syrskyi will agree to that and put resources in there. Right now, I think that he will struggle to insert resources into Avdiivka to assist with the two groups of men who are now effectively cut off. As I'm saying, reports are now that this has devolved for the Ukrainians into two cauldrons. Cauldron being a Russian military term where a group of soldiers become encircled. And that's what appears to have happened. One of those in the southern parts of Avdiivka and one with the coke plant. If General Syrskyi is looking to move reserves there, those reserves will need to be held at some distance because the Russians have good fire control of the areas even to the west of Avdiivka, which is the direction from which these reserves would need to approach. Their approach will be very difficult. Of course, the sky here is full of FPV drones. The Russians have artillery in this area. The Russians have strong counter battery and electronic warfare capabilities in this area, it seems. There are reports coming out that Starlink, which the Ukrainian forces have been relying on for communications, are failing in areas of the front line now. This isn't likely anything to do with Elon Musk turning Starlink off. This is far more likely to do with the enablement of some rumours we heard going back 2 or 3 months that Russia was having success with interfering with Starlink communications. And it seems that now perhaps those rumours were correct and the Russians have now developed some way to deliver that capability to the front line, and this is being used and deployed, and this is making it difficult for the Ukrainians on the front lines to communicate because they've lost Starlink capability. So while General Syrskyi is promising that he will keep Avdiivka, it may be that he has gained control too late and that the situation in Avdiivka has already reached a point beyond Ukrainian ability to claw it back. And we may soon find that the southern part of the city, the remaining 3,000 or so troops that are suggested to have been in Avdiivka. Now, that will be some in the coke plant and some in the southern area, but perhaps the remaining, if we say 2,000 or 1,500 in the southern area, may rapidly find themselves cut off from resupply and forced to either surrender or to attempt to evacuate or to fight till the end, become the three options that they have available to them. Any three of those without the ability to resupply sees the fall of the southern part of Avdiivka. Of course, then the full might of the 30 to 40,000 Russian troops in this area will be turned upon the coke plant, making it even more difficult for them to be resupplied. And again, they're then left with the three options of surrendering to the Russians, of attempting somehow to evacuate, or fighting until the very end for them. What happens after that with those 30 or 40,000 Russian troops now effectively freed up in that area is something that I will come to in a later video. I want to look at what is happening along the front line with some of the Russian advances, where they are likely to move to next, so townships and areas that we can expect fighting to occur in the near future. In an interesting footnote to General Zaluzhny's career here, some interesting questions, some things still unanswered. No decision on what is going to happen to him. There was talk previously that he'd been offered an ambassadorship, perhaps to the UK. He rejected that. He has not reportedly described where he will be going now. There is talk that he still remains part of the team, but no indication of what role he might hold or what that may really mean. I had been, until today, when I saw some footage today, I had been suggesting that General Zaluzhny was in the perfect position to enact a military coup and take control of Ukraine from President Zelensky. I had been basing this on reports that there were large disagreements between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. I think those reports were probably accurate and that there were large and strong disagreements between them. However, today video emerged of an awards ceremony where General Zaluzhny and Kirill Budanov, who's the head of military intelligence, received Order of Ukraine awards. Now, Kirill Budanov, in receiving his award, as you would expect, his normal sort of formal, stilted, uncomfortable looking self, received the award, handshake, turned away. General Zaluzhny, in receiving his award, I have received some level of insight into his relationship with Zelensky, and it is far, far closer, I believe, than what I had thought previously. In the video of Zaluzhny, he's a big man, far bigger man than Zelensky. In receiving his award, smile on his face, embraced President Zelensky as he received the award, stepped back, shook his hand, and then drew him in and embraced him again in a big bear hug. This was, to me, the embrace of these men have deep feelings for each other. You know, they are actually deep friends, and there has been conflict, and this looked like some sort of a resolution of it. It looked as though they were happy to be at this point. This wasn't what looked to me what I may have expected previously to be Zaluzhny accepting a reward half-heartedly because he's intending to enact a coup. I don't think he's going to be enacting a coup now. If he is a brilliant actor, Zaluzhny. What we saw in this video appeared to be real. It appeared to be some sort of relief, and these two not fighting anymore. It was not what I had expected to see in this video, but still questions around what will happen. Perhaps General Zaluzhny, his disagreements with Zelensky, true, heartfelt belief that Ukraine should not be on the offensive, that they cannot continue, they cannot win, they need 500,000 men to win, and if they don't, they will be defeated, has actually seen this as a way out, and he will accept whatever golden handshake will be coming his way and will disappear to whatever nice villa has been gifted to him, and will get out before the ship sinks. I don't know what is going to happen there. As I say, it's not been disclosed, but it's an interesting turn of events there. So just going through the front line in Ukraine in the last 24 hours, as you know, the Russian Ministry of Defense provides a daily update on the number of Ukrainian men which it believes have been killed or wounded. Those numbers over the last few months have hovered anywhere between sort of between 550 men to 850 men, somewhere around there. Yesterday, if the reporting is correct, this number has jumped, and the number is 1,015 men. Now, there have been a few days over the last 6 months when the numbers reported have reached 1,000, but it is not common, and it is a sign that there has been a day of heavy fighting. And we see in some of the areas, Kupiansk reportedly 185 Ukrainian men killed or wounded. Krasny Liman area, nearly 300 men reported there, 290. In the Donetsk region, 300 troops reportedly killed and wounded. We see again continuing losses of artillery pieces reported for the Ukrainians, M119s, D20 and D30 howitzers. In South Donetsk, 190 Ukrainian troops reported lost 2 tanks and an M-Star B howitzer. Zaporozhye, a D30 howitzer, and 50 men in Kherson region. In this area here, loss of a SAM 300 system. So the front line looking similar as it has for the last 2 months. Russian forces holding strategic advancing in many areas. Novomykhailovka, where I showed some footage in yesterday's video, dramatic footage of that thin, long township just being flattened, being leveled with an onslaught of TOS-1 thermobaric warheads descending on Novomykhailovka, incendiary shells, and also what looked like Fab 500 explosions just pounding the area there, looking to reduce any hiding places for Ukrainian troops to be able to defend the town, just leveling it so there's nothing left but broken buildings and basement, nowhere to stand and fight from, nowhere to snipe from. That type of approach seems to be what is happening in Novomykhailovka. Russians appear to be advancing also at Pobeda. However, the Russians having some challenges. Their attacks on the town of Krasnogorovka and Nevelsky reportedly not being successful, even though heavy artillery being used. This is Russian reporting that attacks launched there were not successful in those 2 townships, so being pushed back by the Ukrainians. Avdiivka, of course, as we mentioned before, there's reportedly 3,000 Ukrainian men still in there. As I said, General Syrskyi looking like he might be sending reinforcements. He's going to struggle to get them in there. The Russians moving down to Independence Street, Zapronov Street, Zelensky Lane, moving west of the railway bridge. Now, the railway bridge is right on the western edge of southern Avdiivka, and this is why, if the Russians are getting to the west of that, they have effectively cut the township in half now. Reports that there are tens, if not scores per day of Fab 500 bombs being dropped on the area. Reports from yesterday that at least 65 Fab 500s were dropped in Avdiivka. And of course, the use of other, other TOS-1 type things and aircraft operating in the area. In Zaporozhye, interesting, Zaporozhye and then Kherson, the western area of Zaporozhye, up near the reservoir, the Novokhovka reservoir, it seems that Russian forces are starting to make a move there. Now, this area has been quiet for some time. I might just get to my map on the other screen so I can just show you where we're talking about here. Okay, this water mass here. So the talk is that the Russians are starting to push around the areas here. Pyatikatki, around here, Stepnogorsk, Plavny. So starting to make some moves around here on the western side of the front. Obviously, they have the reservoir here as protection on their western flank. But if movements are starting to be made up here, then the Russians are getting close to the outskirts of Zaporozhye city itself. I mean, the distance from Stepnoresk here is only 25 kilometres to Zaporozhye. A few more kilometres and the outskirts of Zaporozhye fall well within Russian artillery range. So that is happening. And then in Kherson, interesting reports yesterday that in the Kherson region, all of these red-coloured markers that we have here, Belozyorka, Kherson itself, Chernobyevka, Molodozhnoy, Antonovka, Tokarevka, and Tyadginka. All of these areas along here, as of yesterday, are starting to come under long-range fire from the Russians. Previous to this, there have been strikes in these areas, but Russians have tended to be focusing around Krinky, up here, the Cossack camps, Kazachi Laheri, where the Ukrainians have been attempting to use the island areas here to get across and establish a foothold. They've really not been able to do that. Krinky has been a disaster for the Ukrainians in terms of establishing a foothold here. They've had a large number of losses in this area. But now, all along this line here, the Russians starting to attack across the Dnieper River. Just making me wonder if what we're starting to see here are the early stages or preparations to allow the Russians to cross the Dnieper, to move towards Mykolaiv, to move down to Odessa, and form, a barrier along this southern area of Odessa, Mykolaiv, and some of Kherson, north of the Dnieper River. This would align with what President Putin said in his interview with Tucker yesterday, where he gave a long 30-minute speech at the start of the interview explaining Russian history in terms of the region of Russia and Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, all of this area. But basically giving the indication that everything to the east of the Dnieper River, so from up here near Chernihiv, running down, including Kiev city itself, running down to Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, as I say, just looking to perhaps approach towards Zaporozhye, and now looking to perhaps approach and be able to get across the Dnieper. Everything to the east of Dnieper, traditionally Russian land, is what President Putin has explained his position to be. This aligns with what John Mearsheimer and a lot of people have said, that ultimately they see the Dnieper forming what will become the new Russian-Ukrainian border, with the additional southern areas of Mykolaiv and Odessa through here. I believe that what they'll look to do is form a land bridge with Transnistria, which is just on the eastern border of Moldova here, Transnistria being effectively a Russian-friendly enclave within Moldova. If the Russians are able to claim and form a new border across here, then they link Transnistria all the way there, all the way across with these eastern oblasts. I think that Russia and President Putin that would be what they are looking to do. That makes sense to me. If there are negotiations held, I think negotiations may extend far enough to allow what remains of the new Ukraine to have some controlled access to the ports. These will be Russian-controlled ports, but may allow Ukraine to trade and travel to those ports and use them. Of course, it'll be under Russian control. There is still, though, the decision which would need to be made by the new administration of what remains of Ukraine about their demilitarization. Obviously, they would need to not be part of NATO, but beyond that, for Russia to be happy with them to control west of Ukraine, they would need to agree to a level of demilitarization. I had previously suggested this might be a 100-kilometre range. if I just zoom in a little bit here, 100 kilometers from the Dnieper. Now, if I go, let's say, from Kiev out 100 kilometers, that's this far here. So if you run a border that far along the Dnieper River, that would become a demilitarized zone. However, subsequent to me thinking that might be the range I would look to go to, Dmitry Medvedev has spoken about the fact to ensure demilitarization, a buffer zone, and safety for Russia, even for some of the medium-range missiles, so the Scalps, the Storm Shadows, that type of thing, which have a range of about 300 kilometers. We then see a buffer zone coming out to this range here, and that being extended as a demilitarized zone all the way from Transnistria in Moldova, all the way down through Odessa, Mykolaiv, Zaporozhye, Syrsky, up to Kiev, which would leave a very small part in the west of Ukraine possible to house a Ukrainian army and military, but all the rest of this area would become completely demilitarized. That would come under Russian inspection, under Russian electronic warfare control, so that Russians would have their military right up to the river, I imagine, probably stepping their feet across the river where they wanted to, and access points to enable them to move forward if they felt they needed to easily, but then a large 300-kilometre demilitarised zone. Just go, where am I, back here? So things on the front line, not looking good for Ukraine. They haven't for some time. Belgorod, continued attacks on civilian locations in the Russian city of Belgorod, which is just over the border with Ukraine in northern Ukraine. Donetsk, shelling continuing on the civilian areas of Donetsk, although that is likely to decrease significantly once Avdiivka is taken and the Russian forces consolidate there and then start to move Ukrainian positions back further west from there. That's quite likely to happen quickly, given the large number of Russian troops there, which will be freed up from Avdiivka and then able to move through the fields and looking to cut off the crossroads and areas of supply, which, as I say, I'll talk about in another video, perhaps later today or tomorrow. Just finally here, funding. So funding for Ukraine and Israel is still not confirmed. There have been movements in the US Senate to now, again, to step sideways. This is interesting, to step sideways and say, okay, we now want to vote on funding for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan without any ties to the border. So this is being done, I believe, to put pressure back on Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House. Mike Johnson had originally said, we won't approve funding unless you do something with the southern border. You've got to give some funding and come up with a concrete plan that will address the problems we see with the border. I've done an earlier video on that, why Ukraine is so, or why the US southern border is so important to Ukraine, if you want to find out all about that. What the Democrats and Biden and Chuck Schumer and the senators suggested was not adequate for the Republicans in the House. It was still going to allow at least 2 million people to travel undocumented into America each year. So Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, said that's dead on arrival. Now, interestingly, what has happened, the House Appropriations group of Republicans have said, well, we want to give $17 billion just to Israel, separate. Let's get that done. That was voted down. So now the Senate has said, okay, we're going to vote on a package of about $60 billion for Ukraine and $16 billion for Israel and $5 billion for Taiwan, but no ties to the border. And so I think what the approach here is, they're saying, look, Mike Johnson, it's all on you now. Do you want to fund our partners or do you not? So they're trying to put the pressure back on him. Interestingly, it seems as though that may be working. Mike Johnson's rhetoric beforehand was this border bill, which is tied up with funding for Ukraine and Israel, is not good enough. It's dead in the water. It's not going to go ahead. Now, when he's talking about this new Senate proposed bill, which doesn't have any ties to the border, sort of back to where we were before, Now he's saying, well, we need to consider everything on its own merits, and we haven't excluded the ability of funding Ukraine. So I feel as though the pressure might really be mounting on him now, and he's sort of stuck in a hard place. If he does go ahead and fund and agree to this funding without any border consideration, he will be in trouble with House Republicans. Of course, the reason that the border deal bound up with the funding, part of the reason why it wasn't accepted by Mike Johnson because it didn't meet his needs, but it did look publicly and to most people like Biden was doing something. If you read the mainstream press and if you didn't look too closely, it sounded like, oh, Biden wants a new power to close the border and he's come out with a deal that will fix things. It didn't really when you looked at the detail, but most Americans wouldn't look at the detail. However, President Trump has reportedly, and perhaps overplayed his hand here, should have just done this in the background, but reportedly has said, no one can agree to this, because if you do, it will look like Biden's doing something good on the border, and I want to campaign about the border, so you mustn't agree to this. What I think he would have been better to do is had said that in the back rooms, not allowed that to get out, and just let Mike Johnson say, this is no good, doesn't meet our needs, we're rejecting it. It would still then have let Trump campaign. And so Trump will continue to campaign on the border because now they're moving away from the funding package with the border tied to it to a new one without it being tied to it, putting pressure on Mike Johnson. But Mike Johnson is now stuck. If he agrees to fund Ukraine and Israel, a lot of pressure to do that, he's not done anything about the border. Now, he might be able to get out of that now because the Republicans have generally accepted, okay, we're okay with that not happening now because Trump will be able to campaign against Biden on this point. And so maybe interesting to see what's going to happen there. But at this stage, still no funding for Ukraine from the United States. Nothing signed off there, and it looks like it will be another couple of weeks before the votes that would need to occur for that to happen will happen. So it leaves President Zelensky in Ukraine in a position where they are attempting to mobilize, they are attempting to stop the Russians advancing, and they are running into challenges with paying for their public service, to perhaps paying their soldiers, being able to continue to fund them, and having enough funds to be able to, when they do mobilize more people, be able to pay their salaries. So all of these things are challenges for Ukraine at the moment. All right, I'll leave that there. I hope you're having a good weekend. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel and you are enjoying the channel, please subscribe and please feel free to share. I am on X now, posting there, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.